The project we were involved with was the urban-rural connectivity in non-metropolitan regions. And in this project, we basically looked at 4 case study areas that we had defined as being non-metropolitan regions and developed a policy tool to help understand the strategic challenge for these regions, and also a delivery planning tool, to help policymakers to better prioritize the spending of funding and spending of time for planning for these particular regions. And we feel that these tools can also be used by other non-metropolitan regions across the EU for their own strategic and planning needs. And as part of the project, we identified a series of challenges and recommendations that are relevant for EU policymakers, but also regional and national planners across the various member states. And we wanted to reflect on these challenges and make clear some of the solutions that are required to better optimize and integrate these regions into transport and accessibility planning in terms of policy making. And I think the appropriate starting place is to talk about non-metropolitan regions themselves, which are not particularly well defined or very well explained within the literature. Essentially, you look at population-based estimates, and you then realize that non-metropolitan regions are defined as anything that isn't metropolitan or over 250,000 persons in terms of an area. The problem being that these non-metropolitan regions are then presumed to be attached to these metropolitan centres, and anything that is good in terms of policy making for metropolitan centre should have a trickle-down or knock-on effect in these non-metropolitan regions. And what you quickly realise is that when you look at the functionality of these regions, the territories themselves are not connected in a number of instances to these metropolitan centres, but in fact have smaller urban centres where commuting flows and transport and services and economic opportunities are located. And you have smaller population centres in these territories to which populations across rural areas are then connected. And the problem then for these non-metropolitan regions is they tend to fall between 2 stools. They tend to be in between places, where funding in particular is prioritised for metropolitan regions alongside these territories. And when funding cuts arise or austerity measures are taken, they are first to be cut. So they're last to be prioritised and first to be cut. And our project in particular stressed the need to better understand what a functional region is, what the linkages are that create a functional region or create a functional non-metropolitan region in this particular instance. And what we quickly realize is that the needs of these particular regions are distinct from the needs of other territories. So when you look at, for example, connectivity and transport solutions, the solutions being proffered by policymakers tended to be market-led solutions. And the problem in this sense is that market-led solutions tend to not work particularly well in these territories, simply because they are a social construct and promote social cohesion rather than creating opportunity and economic development. The other issue is in terms of economic churn and demographic drain. So the problem in creating functional metropolitan regions that then attract talent from these non-metropolitan areas is that economic leaders within these areas are then starved of appropriately skilled workers, and there's this enormous drain. And so the focus is always to create new economic opportunity from a policymaker's perspective, but the leaders and local stakeholders in these areas are more concerned with maintaining existing economic leaders and ensuring that they get an appropriate pool of skilled labour. And so the other issue, major issue from an economic perspective, in quite a number of these regions was the seasonal fluctuations. The feeling was that when you looked at the tourism sector as a particular area of focus, that metropolitan regions had an almost nostalgic view of these non-metropolitan territories and liked to visit them at particular times of the year and suddenly see an enormous glut of activity across the transport system, but didn't appropriately plan a transport system to cater for that. So you saw this enormous congestion occurring 2 to 3 months of the year, and then an enormous fall off in both employment but also traffic and transport. So it was, again, what's required are more tailored solutions that are created in consultation with stakeholders themselves to better organise and to better plan a transport system for the needs of the non-metropolitan region itself, rather than presuming it as being attached to a larger economic unit. There we go. The other issue that we were asked to emphasise in the project and to bring back to policy making at an EU but also national and regional level was institutional frameworks and institutional representation. The classic example given very early on in the project by the lead stakeholder from Scarborough was a regional plan for transport that was created at a regional level, but the realisation was that they'd forgotten to give an appropriate amount of funding to the lead stakeholder and to Scarborough, so they put a purple box over the territory on the map and covered it with the name of the plan so everybody could realise, forget that they had forgot to appropriately fund this territory. And they are very keen to have a place at the table in terms of policy making. And one of the suggestions that we brought back then was I have 30 seconds. Wow. Thank you, Lauren. It's not coming back, I presume. I'll just put it on here. So the other issue then was around institutional frameworks and getting a place at the table for appropriate representation of these local stakeholders in transport planning and in policy making. Now, again, and I can finish on this point, one of the key issues for these territories was that funding availability from regional, national, and even supranational funders was ad hoc. They had the skills, but not the capacity to deliver on these projects and on these funding call opportunities. And what they, again, stressed was the need to improve accessibility to funding opportunities, but by essentially ring-fencing them for non-metropolitan regions. But also, again, making the bureaucratic burden in terms of applying for, being made aware of, and taking advantage of such funding opportunities to simplify it and ensure that territories and municipalities with low levels of capacity but high levels of skills could appropriately respond to these funding calls. Thank you very much.